Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another thrilling episode of History Talks. I'm your professor, Mr. Martinez, and today we delve into one of the most pivotal chapters in human history, World War II. The 20th century was a period of unprecedented global change and upheaval. As the world grappled with dire global issues, one conflict emerged that would shape the course of history like no other. World War II, often referred to as the Good War, transformed nations, redrew maps, and left an undeniable mark on the United States. Through the events of time, exploring the significance of World War II in the context of American history, from the devastating attack of Pearl Harbor to the historic D-Day landing in Normandy, we'll uncover the trials, sacrifice, and triumphs of who is referred as the greatest generation. But World War II wasn't just about battles and heroes. It's also witnessing unimaginable horrors in the form of Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and questionable domestic affairs like Japanese internment camps. As we explore this era, we'll understand how World War II fundamentally transformed the United States, both as a superpower on the world stage and as a society at home. The war brought unprecedented economic growth, social changes, and laid the foundation of the American dream. So join us on this journey as we explore into the dire global issues that necessitated World War II and the profound impact it had on the United States, a nation that emerged from the conflict forever changed. This is a story of courage, sacrifice, and enduring power of the human resilience. This is History Talks. As you guys know, World War II is a monumental moment in both American history and also human history, with it being the last large global world war that the world has seen, and of course with this world war being the result leading to United States being the world power that you see today. We're going to talk about many of the actions in which it evolved to eventually United States being one of the many winners within the World War II Allied powers. Now, there's going to be a lot that we're going to talk about. Matter of fact, we're going to have a little bit of a transition and intermission for these, just before the extent that we're having. The first segment of today is really going to be focusing on these things. So, taking a look right here, we're going to be looking at the road to the war itself. We're going to talk about militarism and fascism in Europe and Asia, kind of giving us a quick recap of perhaps what we may remember from our previous history classes or from even the History Channel. We're just going to recap on what the situation is. Then we'll talk about United States evolving into its involvement in the war. You're going to see there's going to be a lot of conversation of neutrality and isolationism, just like in World War I, where many Americans are reluctant to join in this global conflict. But eventually we do get involved, and that's going to be talking about the evolution of our neutrality stance changing into eventually intervention, but then also the final moment being the attack of Pearl Harbor. We're going to talk about mobilization of the military and the economy, focusing on the military strategy in which it took to win both the Pacific War Theater and the European War Theater, as there are two fronts the United States faces during World War II. Then, of course, we're going to do an overview on the war on the home front. And what I mean by this is, what is this experience of war doing to the American society back home? As it is now in a total war commitment, much of our nation transforms in the name of trying to win the war, and transforming so much in both society, culturally, and economically. Now, to save us some time, I'm actually going to make you guys do an assignment where we focus on that and leave that part out of this history talk, simply for some time management. But when you do that assignment, you will be looking at the role of women in the domestic economy. You'll look at the role of ethnic and racial minorities in the war front, and also the domestic impact of the war itself. But for this episode, we're really focusing on military strategies. And that's going to be something we look at next with military campaigns in World War II, especially with the role of U.S. military and how we help assist the Allied powers to victory itself. And then lastly, the aftermath of World War II, the diplomacy, and also some of the big decisions that led to the end of the war, being the dropping of the atomic bomb, but then also the aftermath of how to create new systems in these places that have been destroyed by the ruins of World War II. Like I said, there's a lot, and there's a reason why we have an intermission. Our essential question is, how did wartime necessities challenge the ethical and moral standards of war? That's going to be our focus as we talk more about the things in which we question of not only United States actions, but also other nations' actions in their aspects and ambitions of being the next world order. So, let's dive in, shall we? Quick reminder, just to make sure that we're all on the same page with our understanding of World War II. There are largely two different sides to this war. There is the Axis powers, and then of course there is the Allied powers. When we talk Axis powers, we're talking about Italy being ran by a dictator named Mussolini. We're talking about Germany under Adolf Hitler. We're also talking about Japan with a general named Tojo running the militaristic campaigns for Japan. And then with the Allied powers, you're going to see Britain with Winston Churchill being the leader in the time period, United States being with Franklin D. Roosevelt during this time of crisis, and also the Soviet Union with Joseph Stalin. Maybe some of you guys are pondering for a second, maybe remembering Stalin being on the Axis powers. And you wouldn't be wrong to remember that. That's a quick switch later on in our storytelling, where Stalin used to be greatly a threat to these Western democracies with communism and much more from this dictator. We'll get there though. This is just the overall gist of what the teams look like. So let's go ahead and set the stage with all the aspects that is before the rise of dictators in this time period. We're going to be setting the stage by focusing on debt and diplomacy, as they both play a role within the circumstances of a lot of the European conditions. Now, you're going to notice I'm going to talk about both Europe and Latin America in the slide. The reason why is because I get a lot of students who ask me, what was up with Latin America during World War II? Where was their involvement? And while some of them did contribute to the Allied powers, many were dealing with more of internal conflicts in this time period that kind of left them on the sidelines of this battle. We're not going to kind of focus on both of them. I'm going to start with the 1920s first. So you're going to see my two boxes here. I'm going to start with the right-hand side, where we're going to talk about Europe and the situation that they have. If you don't remember, after World War I, Europe is in a lot of economic disarray. Germany has been put in a particular position of being placed the sole blame of all of World War I, now having to pay reparations, more so than its counterparts being Austria-Hungary and also the Ottoman Empire. By the 1920s, Europe was struggling to repay the $11 billion in loans to the United States. Germany is given a loan so that they're even able to pay the reparation payments to then France and Britain. So Germany was in such an economic position where they weren't even able to pay the reparation payments and then had to take a loan from the United States to be able to pay the reparation bill, further creating a cycle of debt, if you see. This is going to result to eventually what is considered the hyperinflation of Germany as they face their Great Depression, perhaps much worse than ours. But focusing back on this, Europe is on the brink of economic collapse, as many nations are struggling. And with these nations struggling, it will lead to suffering and frustration. And with suffering and frustration, you'll see as a typical human behavior that people become far more vulnerable and drastic with whom they are willing to follow in the name of trying to resolve these issues. As many dictators will see this as an opportunity for them to be able to rise in power. Now, the 1920s in Latin America has a similar aspect. Similar to Europe, U.S. banks offered large loans to Latin American governments. They too would have some difficulty repaying these loans. And this eventually will result into then more American corporations and military expanding in these areas. There was a nature of the United States to send its military forces. You'll see that we'll be using our military force quite a lot more in Latin America as we use it along with the issues of the destabilizations of Latin American nations due to defaulting on loans and also other circumstances of it disrupting our business interest in those areas. With that, though, that's kind of the 1920s. We see a lot of these issues of nations close to bankrupt or struggling to pay the loans and able to maintain their nations from destabilization. But then the 1930s come, and with the 1930s comes FDR, and we see a little bit of a change to some of these things. For example, talking still about Latin America, FDR will actually start a new policy called the Good Neighbor Policy, which is increasing U.S.'s imports and exports to Western hemispheres by 100%. Huge, significant. The reason why, of course, is because of the stimulation that he has created within the U.S. economy and needing markets to buy and sell all of the things that America is creating. Also, you'll see that he will open up new relations with Latin American nations with the Internal American Conference, where he promises no state has the right to intervene in internal or external affairs of another. This was another moment where United States is opening up better terms with these neighbors for the sense of economic reciprocal participation and also more mutual understanding of popular sovereignty in the name of trying to create stabilization in those areas, which that's exactly what it does. Latin America is kind of saved from the magnitude of the Great Depression effects around the world. And because of that, you won't see too much of the same festering of rises of totalitarians in this time period due to this productivity that is happening between the two continents. Then, of course, there is Europe. And with Europe, FDR also did a drastic different change in direction of how to handle this situation. FDR decided to forbid American banks to any nation in default of its debts. It didn't follow Hoover's debt settlements that he was doing with these international trade agreements. Instead, it was this idea, once again, of trade reciprocal deals. FDR was making deals with these nations saying, if you open your markets and buy more American goods, we are willing to make a deal of lowering down our tariffs or handling some of the reparation payments. You'll see that this helps out greatly some of these nations, but it does not do enough for the sense of the amount of festering that is happening within the economic collapse in Europe. And that collapse will lead to the situation. And here's the situation, folks. You'll see a rising of multiple different dictators who will all have somewhat similar themes of ambitions for their nations. We're going to go ahead and talk about a few of these. Now, we all know some of them. We all know the man in the mustache, but then we don't recognize sometimes that there are two, if you're also talking about Joseph Stalin. But how many of us remember Benito Mussolini? How many of us recall Francisco Franco? Let's give us a recap, shall we? I'm going to start from the left and can carry on to the right. In the left, we're going to talk about Benito Mussolini of Italy. Promises this nation in 1922 a new kind of Roman society, a restoring of the glory of the Roman Empire, as Mussolini would want to bring the glory days back to Italy, where it had far control and reach all around the world. He promised this revival of economy, and all this with the usage of fascism. Fascism stresses nationalism and places the interests of the state above those of the individual. It's like a super nationalism that is invoked into the citizens and expected within its full aspect of holding control in that nation. You'll see that Mussolini will try to start this rebirth of the Roman Empire as he both joins the Axis powers and starts to invade northern Africa to claim these new lands. I have a lot of these famous quotes from each of these dictators because they're kind of interesting characters with their thinking. Like, for example, here's this quote from Benito Mussolini, who says, "Let us have a dagger between our teeth, a bomb in our hands, and an infinite scorn in our hearts." Really trying to show the strength of this idea of a new nation, one to be not reckoned with. Then let's talk about the next gentleman below. Now, a lot of people ask me, what's up with Spain during World War II? And they are having their own things going on. And they are relatively tied to World War II, but they relatively stay also neutral during World War II. And that's because of this man right here, Francisco Franco. Now, Francisco Franco was once a Spanish military general who then creates a military coup to overthrow the Second Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. And in this moment, you will see this man lead a nationalist force to violently overthrow the government in that time period. And in the span of 1939 to 1975, this man will hold control after his overthrow, where he is now the man in charge and also is taking the last steps of democracy away from the Spanish government. You'll see that Francisco Franco will be busy in that time period as he continues to handle internal conflicts of civil wars. And in that time period, that's why he stays neutral. He has sympathy for the Axis powers. Matter of fact, many even connect him getting assistance from both Mussolini and Hitler in his rise to power. But he will largely stay occupied in his own nation and not getting involved elsewhere. A quote for him is this: "We do not believe in government through the voting booth. Spain has no foolish dreams." Really showing him ditching the last democratic principle. Let's move ahead and move on to the man in the middle, and that is Adolf Hitler from Germany. We all understand that Adolf Hitler was once a World War I soldier who then is discharged from his injuries and becomes disillusioned by the new Germany, the defeated Germany. Under its hyperinflation, he sees a moment of opportunity where he is able to gather more people to follow his new movement that he adopts and finds, that is the Socialist Workers' Party in Germany. This Socialist Workers' Party will eventually transform into the Nazi Party, where now he becomes the leader of this party that has many crazy ambitions. One of them, of course, is his racial purification, leaving only the master race in his eyes to rule over all others. He also creates this new ideology as well of Nazism, this German brand of fascism based on extreme nationalism. This is going to be his largest push of both nationalism and racial superiority, as the idea that Hitler and Germany deserve much more than what was given to them after World War I. He really wants revenge for Germany's loss in World War I and the revenge of the Treaty of Versailles, which was punishing them in a more unfair balance compared to the other Axis powers. We remember that with World War I, it doesn't start with Germany. They're just a mere ally who gets entangled. But they are one of the largest Axis powers who do have good involvement within World War I. He wants to take back the land that was taken from Germany during the Treaty of Versailles. Places like the Rhineland, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia. Here's a quote for you when it comes to Adolf Hitler. Make the lie big. Make it simple. Keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it. Really highlighting this man's manipulation of the crowd, being able to have them do things that once would be considered unheard of from other nations. Now, let's go ahead and move on to the gentleman to the right, who is also referred to as a crazy dictator during this time period. The Man of Steel, as his nickname goes, Joseph Stalin of Soviet Union. Soviet Union is the new country that represents Russia. This new ambitious idea of their own of communism, a new economic system in which is to battle and combat against many capitalistic methods. This communist leader will eliminate all his competition after Lenin's death, and really giving him the iron fist of strength and control over his nation. He then quickly does this 5-year plan to industrialize Russia, as it was really behind compared to the other European and industrialized countries. And then also he was considered a threat in this time period for his also ambitions to expand the communist empire. He even signs a non-aggression pact with Germany and also invades Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all these European countries that get closer to the Western European nations. Here's a quote for you with Joseph Stalin. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why would we let them have ideas? Really showing his censoring of his people when it comes to thought, opposition, and criticism of his new reign. And then another individual that many of us maybe are not familiar with, this is Hideaki Tojo. Tojo is going to represent Japan. Now, Japan has an emperor, but they also have a prime minister. And this gentleman was both the prime minister and the general for the new Japanese nation. I say new Japanese nation because they're going through a huge transformation in their country, growing into this new ultra-nationalism and a sense of racial superiority of their own. They start to become militaristic. And the reason why they start to do this is to start to compete against Western democratic nations, or the West as they see it. They've seen the West take on many of these ambitions of creating empires and starting imperialism, and Japan wants its turn. It wants its moment of being considered an equal when it comes to the global stage. You'll see that they become more modernized in this time period and become also a nation that will start to use this imperialism as they start to move into new territories for the sense of trying to acquire new resources that were once limited to their island. Japan will continue this imperialistic quest in the Pacific as it also invades islands and nations such as Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. These don't sound like big nations or territories, but they are very strategically important, both for their resources and the military strength of who can control the Pacific Ocean. Here's a quote for us when it comes to Tojo. He once said, "Emperor Hirohito will believe what we tell him to believe." Really showing him being the man pulling the strings when it comes to the actions of the Japanese with what they do during World War II. This is the situation, folks. This is what is at hand that the Western democratic nations had to deal with. And with failed diplomacy, these dictators will rise and become more emboldened with their actions. Let's do a quick checkpoint. The situation in Europe in the 1920s and also the 1930s. From what you've heard, what is the situation? What's the stage like before the actual actions take place? Thank you. I appreciate that. And now we have some breaking news for you. Matter of fact, in this episode, I have lots of news footage showing the moments in which the world is being aware of these actions of these dictators. Here's the first one for you. It's Mussolini invading Ethiopia, one of the first actions of World War II. Take a look, and I'll see you when you're back here. Thank you. I really appreciate the old footage. It really shows the magnitude of the concern and also the severity that it was back then. But now with these actions going on, what is the United States' reaction? Well, you're going to see it is a rise of isolationism. Similar to World War I, isolationism in U.S. will be at an all-time high due to old Wilsonian internationalists grown disillusioned with the League of Nations and its inability to stop aggressions in Asia and Europe. Many of those who had the idea of creating democracy and creating this world peace organization start to believe that those aspects maybe aren't able to be true when there comes the real challenge of these dictators and them not being able to stop it. Other Americans believe in the argument that a Senate committee revealed actually profiteering and blatant tax evasion by many corporations and suggested that bankers pressured Wilson to intervene in the war to protect those loans abroad and business interest. When this becomes what is being told as the narrative among the American society, a lot of veteran soldiers, the lost generation, and those who participated on the home front would start to feel that all of this was for nothing but just mere profits of the rich. That is what the narration is, which then leads to them no longer wanting to participate in the Second World War. With isolationism blocking any internationalist involvement policies, and now with the Spanish Civil War and Mussolini starting his invasion of Africa, United States will sign the Neutrality Act of 1939 and 1936. These were both designed initially to establish an arms embargo against both aggressors and victims, and it is a real reflection showing, it's a real moment of really showing that the trauma of World War I echoes in the policies of this time period, as they don't want to get entangled with trading like they did before, leading into the United States being pulled further in when it was once the arms, as it once was the dealer of armaments back then. Along with it, you'll also see that it empowered the government to give travel warnings. So not only was it the fear of what happened in the past with us being a war dealer trader, but it was also the issues of transport ships and also passenger ships with Americans being sunken by German submarine that led for us to be really wary of United States. This is the first actions of United States. But we're going to see that change with time to the rise of dictatorships. Remind me that you just heard this. Remind me that you know this, right? Remind me that you know this right after you heard this last part of our history talks. Thank you. I appreciate it. And with this just in, there's a new event that happened. This time, Nazis and the Soviet Union invade Poland. Let's take a look and see how that goes. Thank you very much. And as you can see, this moment seems dire. So, what is the United States' response? Well, you're going to see a little bit of a change from isolationism to then intervention. With the world's conditions growing more concerning, the Neutrality Act of 1937 creates a new policy called the cash and carry policy. Nations could purchase only non-military goods from the U.S. and had to pay in cash and carry the goods away on their own vessels. Once again, hear that World War I trauma? We don't want our transport ships getting caught in this. Really showing us trying to echo the isolationism policy. President and the majority of American people, even in this time of isolationism, did favor a side. We favored Britain and France and the other allied nations in this conflict. We didn't want to make that be our official stance, though. FDR asked Congress eventually for revisions to the Neutrality Act so that maybe he could provide armaments to counter the Germans' production, but powerful isolationist opposition made him have to settle for the Neutrality Act of 1939. This allowed the U.S. to sell armaments, but still within cash and carry policy. So now we'll sell you the guns, the tanks, the weapons, the ammunition, but still cash, and you pick up. Still holding down that line. While we dance on this line between isolationism and intervention, the Axis powers are advancing quickly. They're doing new strategies with this new military technology, something called blitzkrieg, or in English, the lightning war. This is the use of tanks and air power technology to strike a devastating blow against the enemy and bum rushing them to overwhelm them in the front lines. The Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, bombed airfields, factories, and towns and cities. By April 1940, Hitler will launch a blitzkrieg against Norway and Denmark. Both will fall soon to Nazi control, and then France will be next. That's the situation as the United States is dancing with its policies. This just in, the Nazis did in fact invade France. Here's some news footage breaking that moment for the world with one of the largest nations of the democratic systems now being confronted by these Nazis. How will it go for them? Take a look. Thank you very much. Now, what is the United States' reaction with Hitler and the Nazis now in France? By 1940, the fall of France was imminent, and FDR begun to increase his aid to the Allies. He started preparations to resist possible Nazi invasion of the U.S. by seeking a $1 billion increase to military. FDR proclaimed that the U.S. would extend to the opponents of force the material resources of this nation, showing this push of counteracting the Axis powers movement. Churchill, being one of the few nations left in Europe, will start to hear this call, and UK creating a long list of war material requests that will be things for them to be able to defend against the Axis powers. We do these things while we circumvented the cash and carry policy, finally breaking that policy and getting fully involved without those protocols. We're able to do this because of the shifting public opinion in the United States, which changed from U.S.'s ability to help, which did change the United States' ability to help. Before France's invasion, majority of Americans did not even see Germany as a direct threat to our nation. After France being defeated and now Britain being the next nation as a target, 66% of Americans believe that Germany poses as a threat to our nation. We really have a great shift with the fall of France. FDR secures a third term during this time period, as this is a weird moment. There is no policy of the 2 terms just yet, and FDR is able to secure a third term presidency because of the fear of wartime, because of the wartime fears. Along with it, there was a 2 liberal Democratic alternative candidate within the Democratic ticket, and then there was also a 2 isolationist Republican on the Republican ticket. So many Americans didn't want to take the extremes and felt more secure with FDR being in charge of the circumstance. While this is happening, though, France is completely lost to the Nazis. What is left of the British and French forces are now trapped on a peninsula called Dunkirk. English ships will make a desperate attempt to save British and French troops trapped by the Germans. The British improvise and send all available naval vessels, merchant ships, and even fishing and pleasure boats across the channel to pluck stranded troops off of the beach of Dunkirk. The success and rescue of Dunkirk really raised the morale of the British, but it also showed that this was a moment of defeat as they had to retreat from the continent of Europe that is now within control of the Nazi power. A crazy change and a moment of darkness for many of the democratic nations around. And do this checkpoint. How did United States neutrality stance change and evolve with the events that happened in Europe in this next part? How did it change? What event happened that changed United States' mind? Perfect. Thank you. Let's move on, shall we? So, in this slide, we're now seeing neutrality abandoned. It is no longer as strong anymore. And the reason why is because the Axis powers have been busy since you've been doing that checkpoint. The Axis powers, by September of 1940, started to bomb England for 57 days straight, both day and night, with the German Luftwaffe, who constantly bombed the island, both cities, factories, and everything, to completely disrupt the British nation. England was the last nation standing against the Nazi invasion of all of Europe. In London, the government and citizens had to continue their lives with this constant bombardment, seeking safety in underground shelters, and thousands were killed and injured, and much of London was destroyed because of the Blitz. In this time period, UK is virtually bankrupt and can't even afford our cash and carry policies anymore. And then FDR had to create a new system to be able to continue to help the British even in this moment of no ability to pay. And that is the Lend-Lease policy. This would allow the government not only to sell, but also to lend or lease armaments to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the U.S. as a way to justify this next trade. Essentially, United States is going to funnel weapons to UK in exchange for a promise that UK will repay them after the war. This is when United States will supply them with new military technology like sonar and radar, which will alter UK's fate. With sonar and radar being a new military technology, the German Luftwaffe no longer have the element of surprise. The British can now know and predict when the Germans will be there to bomb, and are now able to counteract with their planes in time to enter of Great Britain. Germany was unsuccessful in capturing England, and British morale continued through the bombing. After a series of brutal bombings, England did not surrender. What a crazy moment. In a moment that seems so bleak, these individuals chose to continue carrying on. A real testament of resilience. Here's that checkpoint for you though. What is Lend-Lease program and how did it have an impact? You just heard it. What's the answer? Thank you. I appreciate it. And with that, here is some news footage showing England surviving the Blitz. I really want to show the magnitude of damage during this one. Watch this video and see it with your own eyes. Thank you. I appreciate it. With all this going on, World War II grows into a bigger conflict, and it's because of a lot of the Axis powers. Now, unsuccessful in their attacks of Britain, Hitler will turn his attention towards his once friend, or at least ally in this time period, which is the Soviet Union. Germany will break its Nazi-Soviet pact in June of 1941 and initiate Operation Barbarossa. If you don't know, Operation Barbarossa is the largest military assault that has ever happened in human history. A large-scale blitzkrieg across the vast nation that is Russia. What is Hitler doing, and what's his justification? Well, he justifies his double cross for the need for living space for the Germans and to win control of the region's riches in resources. In reality, Hitler wanted Siberia, Ukraine, the Ural Mountains range that were full of plentiful resources, essentially oil being vital to the war machine that any nation needs to have. He wanted to secure it for the name of his country. The ultimate goal was to also crush communism and Stalin, which Hitler saw as a huge threat to the Nazi Party and really Germany's control. Though this operation was initially successful for Nazi Germany, it is argued to be one of Hitler's greatest mistakes in all of World War II. So much so that many would say that if he had not done this, he could have won the war. Meanwhile, Japan has continued to invade nations in the Pacific, such as Indochina and now Vietnam. Japan then joins in a defensive alliance with Germany and Italy in this time period. The United States responds by establishing a complete trade embargo, severely limiting Japan's ability to purchase essential supplies, such as oil. Remember, Japan's on an island. They're in a particular position where they heavily rely on the imports of other nations. And with them being cut off, it really puts them in a corner where they now have to make a choice. Do they continue being a militaristic, imperialistic nation, invading others? Or do they make amends with the United States? If they continue with what they're doing, they could secure resources, or they can continue to rely on the United States for those resources. They're going to choose this action as they continue to invade into these places, causing mass atrocities of their own. If you're looking at my images, you're going to see the control that the Japanese have in this time period, which is great in this moment, and also seeing the Nazis fully invade this Russian front that is now Operation Barbarossa. I really want to showcase in this part how much the Japanese have made grounds and have advanced within their military campaigns. Take a look at this video that really shows that development, showcasing their advancements as well. Thank you. I appreciate it. Alrighty, now we're going to talk about what does get United States involved. As many of us know, the attack of Pearl Harbor is that one moment that the Empire of Japan had felt slighted by the Western powers, ignored by the World War I conference, and with the restriction of oil and other resources, they no longer felt the need to comply with missions. They also wanted to be considered a global equal and wanted to be considered a nation to not be reckoned with. In 1941, they will do a surprise attack on a naval base in Hawaii that United States has as a foothold of our presence in the Pacific. It was completely surprise and undefended. These ships were being locked at bay in their ports, not in position of defense. These Japanese planes, hundreds of them that came across the ocean, were transported by carriers that snuck above the Pacific to get into range as they traveled 4,000 miles to be able to issue this attack. The death and destruction is damning for the United States. 20 ships, 300 planes, 2,403 people killed, another 1,000 wounded. It paralyzes the United States Pacific Naval Fleet, which will lead to a delay in our response back as we try to rebuild so then we can advance. The significance is after a period of isolationism, Congress will declare war on the Axis powers in response to the attack of Pearl Harbor. It really does lead to the moment that the United States does get involved, as this is the chain of events that leads us to now being fully engaged, now that the war has met us on our own territories. So, United States is now officially in World War II. What will be our actions? What will be our first moves? What will be your answer to this checkpoint question? Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? And why is it significant? Remind yourself of why this is an important historical event. Thank you. I appreciate it. And now, United States is in. How will the Allies turn the tides? We're going to take a quick pause because that's the next segment for us in this history talk. And I know you and I could use a break after what we've heard. So, when you're ready, come back to class and we'll go ahead and hear this next part. Alrighty, folks, you ready for some more? Let's go ahead and get started with the second half of our episode, which is going to be Allies Turn the Tide. We'll finally talk about what is the second half of World War II, with the Allied powers now at full force, with the United States finally involved. Let's go ahead and get started in this next segment. Just a quick recap, I want to go ahead and remind ourselves of what the teams look like in this time period now, and also some of their recent actions. Once again, Allied powers is now United States, Britain, what is left of the French, which is mostly going to be French resistance in Nazi occupation, and then also now Soviet Union, who switched sides, if you remember, from our first episode, our first segment. The Axis powers are now Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, remember, Germany did invade the Eastern European nations and was bombing Great Britain. Hitler had broken the Nazi-Soviet pact and had now continued to attack the Soviet Union. Japan has also been busy as it launched its U.S. bombing on a military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and also began its large-scale invasion throughout the Pacific, taking control of several new territories. The Allied powers in this point aren't looking too good. We have, of course, France, who's been seized by the Germans, Britain, who is maintaining their ground after the multiple bombings, that is the London Blitz. You now have, in response, the United States being involved after the attack of Pearl Harbor, breaking its policies of isolationism, and now, of course, the Soviet Union working in collaboration with the Allied powers after Hitler breaks that pact. Neither the Allied powers or the Soviet Union trust each other, which is an important note to make for the fact of what happens next with the Cold War. In this time period, it really is that idea of like frenemies, that the common thing you both have is simply the wanting of another nation to be destroyed, having an enemy in common. That's what really puts the Soviet Union in connection with the Allied powers, more than anything. Along with it, this is kind of what that landscape looks like with the Axis powers and the Allied powers. And, of course, here's the timeline of the things we're going to focus on that will lead to eventually the end of World War II. We will talk quite a lot of different battles, as you can see. So, let's first recognize how military strategy is for the United States. You have to understand, there's a two-front war we're handling. There is the Pacific War Theater, and then there's the European War Theater. And both of those theaters of war are vastly different in the strategies, the conditions, and everything. I'm going to talk Pacific first on the left. In 1941, days after Pearl Harbor attack, Japan takes Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, Dutch East Indies, Burma, and much more. The United States took months to be able to regain its naval forces to the full strength to be able to commit to a series of island naval invasions of what was now Japanese occupied territory. This hopping from one island to another within the sequence of first air bombing the island territory and then using your naval bombardment, lastly your soldiers invading through the beaches, and then your heavier equipment, this was called island hopping, and that was the way in which that the Pacific War Theater had to constantly be played at. No real large cities, No going through the country town like in Europe. Here it is island to island, from one barren island to then another that has all different conditions that are considered inhospitable. By mid 1943, after the Battle of Coral Sea and Midway, Japan will lose its ability to be on the offensive with U.S. advancement. So eventually, the Japanese will lose their momentum now with the naval fleet of the United States being able to counteract it, us further pushing the boundaries of what was Japanese control. And then, of course, there is the European theater. European theater, absolutely different. By 1941, Germany's attention was on its invasion of the Soviet Union. Britain wanted to first launch a series of Allied offensives around the end of the Nazi Empire, which would be Northern Africa. In Northern Africa and the Southern European area is where the United States and the Allied powers are going to want to get involved. And that's the area in which they see the biggest focus to be when concentrating on how are they first going to handle the Axis powers. They really wanted to practice before they really went into Europe on seeing how their enemy strategized with all of their methods. Now, by mid-1943, the U.S. and Allied powers will start to push back the Axis powers from Africa and start its invasion of Italy. They managed to collapse Mussolini's power with their invasion, which then had the Nazis holding down a line and pushing any more Allied advance from this southern European area. We do take out Mussolini first, and that's a great triumph. But the Nazis have a stronghold for the most of the continent of Europe. Now, the United States is going to be focusing on France and how we're going to start to reclaim this lost land. This is the different experience that I wanted you to understand between the different two war theaters that we have during World War II. Here's a checkpoint. From what you just heard, what is that difference between the two, Pacific and the Europe War Theater? Go ahead and answer that for me before we continue. Thank you. All right, so what is now changing in the United States? Well, with the Axis powers making significant gains in territories in Europe and in the Pacific, the Allied powers decide to focus all of their resources in order to defeat the Axis powers. This is what's called total war, which is a total commitment to war itself in the name of transforming everything in your society. Economically, socially, culturally, everything is about the war. Everyone is focused on the war, is what is total war. In 1939, the federal budget was $9 billion, but by 1945, it had risen to $100 billion, largely a result of the gross national product that risen from $91 billion to $166 billion. Not only was our dealings with the trade reciprocal handling with both Latin America and some of the European nations that were standing, but also the long list of orders for war goods was really what kept up our economy and built it up. The United States directed all of their economic resources into the war effort with agencies like the War Production Board. Just like if you remember in World War I, there's going to be a lot of government agencies that are in charge of controlling different aspects. This one is ensuring that we transform all of our factories towards war factories. They would stop public goods and start making war goods like bullets, bombs, tanks, ships, ammunition, you name it. We were creating all the weapons and arsenal we need to be able to win this war. The government is going to call for rationing within the United States, where United States citizens are going to be given ration cards, where they're only able to consume only a certain amount of goods at grocery stores to be able to save and conserve for the war itself. Even encouraging United States citizens to create victory gardens to be able to not even use consumer goods instead of it letting it be used in the war. Other ration items would be like food, tin, rubber, gasoline, anything that would be considered essential during this war. We're even talking like, for example, women's stockings. Women's stockings were a trend in this time period, but eventually become very difficult or near impossible to find during World War II, as all of the material was required for the creation of parachutes for paratroopers. Things like that would radically change from one material to now a war goods material. Also, with 15 million men and women in service abroad, employment was accessible to those who were once wasn't. You're going to see another rush of people who were once blocked out of our economy now given an opportunity to be able to participate in it with the vacancy of wartime. War propaganda encouraged people also to work, donate with things like war bonds, ration, spy, and comply with all these wartime policies. Wartime science and technology advancements were also at an increase due to wanting to counteract the enemy's offensives. New tanks, planes, bombers, weapons, radar, sonar, all these new devices were going to be used to counteract what was the German and Axis powers' military strategies. We even create certain programs that are meant to gather intelligence through a large network of spies. This would be like the Ultra program, which was created to be able to get as much intel on the enemy to be able to get the upper hand in the name of the battlefield. All of this are going to be the things that we're focusing on in the name of transforming our society to ensure victory in World War II. Now, we could talk much more about the home front experience. Matter of fact, there are so many unique experiences for different Americans in our country, from Japanese Americans to Native Americans, from Black Americans to Mexican Americans, from women to all. There's so much radical change. And to save us from having an even longer history talks, I have an overview assignment where I'm going to have you focus on much more of the demands that come from this time period of World War II home front. But I'm going to save that for that assignment because we're really just going to focus on the strategies that lead to the Allied powers winning in this episode. So let's talk about the direction changes then. Now you see the Allied powers focus on France being the next target. And they start to put together what is called D-Day. D-Day is when the Allied powers return back to France to be able to reclaim this territory. And this was a large-scale project. There was many different levels to it. It is still considered the largest naval assault that has ever happened in human history, with multiple collaborations of Canadian, British, other Allied powers, and United States all working together to start this spearheading into entering into France. There was even this deceptive campaign among this, where we created something like the Ghost Army, which was us literally creating a fake army that was positioned on a different side of this channel between England and Great Britain. And it was a way to deceive the Nazis to think that we were going to launch our attacks somewhere else. But rather, over there, it was just fake dummies and inflatable tanks. There was just a lot to this. The Allied troops will cross the English Channel and storm the beach in Normandy, France. Allied troops reach the interior of France and also will join with the French resistance fighters once they're able to move further inside into the country. By August of 1944, after a series of campaigns, the Allied troops will eventually reach Paris and drive out the Germans to retreat further back to Germany. There was a lot of different aspects to this war in between that really led to this victory. There's another one that is highlighted, which I have, is Battle of the Bulge, which happened in December of 1944, where Germans were beginning to lose grounds of the Allied forces further with their advancement. Constant air bombing from the Allies have devastated the German military bases, factories, railroads, oil depots, and also the cities. We really cut down the supply line to these further extended Nazi forces, which then later led to the demise of their forces being able to hold against the Allied forces. It was a war on two fronts for the Germans, Allied troops are attacking Germans from the west, while the Soviet Union is attacking Germany from the east, creating a very difficult position for Germany to be able to make any advancement on either side. Germany was suffering large civilian and military casualties in this time period, leading to Hitler's support. The Battle of Stalingrad starts to be a turning point within the Eastern Front, where the Germans overcommitted to that area and actually lost it, with it also the momentum they had. So, now with the Allied powers pinching further into Europe, we start to discover some of the handlings of the Germans. One of these is, for example, the Holocaust and the death camps. While dealing with the global crisis, U.S. government confronted the Nazi campaign to exterminate the Jews, Poles, Gypsies, homosexuals, and the communists in Europe. Anyone who was deemed undesirable in what is Hitler's vision in his master race. This is what was being done within Nazi-occupied territories. Now, United States had a couple of moments in which they could have acted on this. And there's a few kind of dark moments with the decision making we had when it came to handling this. For example, U.S. resisted all motions such as hindering death camp operation by bombing their railroads and crematories when we were aware of this thing. We decided not to attack those areas as we thought it would be infeasible for us to succeed with a bombing run. Also, we rejected admitting large numbers of Jewish refugees during this time period. There are a few records of large boats full of Jewish refugees who are escaping Hitler's wrath and going to the United States in the sake of hoping to reach asylum. The United States government actually rejected them from being able to be registered in for asylum, which was a real dark moment in our American history, as we had to send back those refugees to Europe, kind of with the fate that would have been ill to them. Now, some people ask, why did the United States do that? And there was a few different State Department officials who had a very large role in the decision making and decided to reject this due to anti-Semite rhetoric that they also had within them. So there was a little bit of racial tendency that led to that. The only thing that the United States does is commit to ending this war as soon as possible in the hopes of liberating camps on the way and ending the operation that the Nazis were holding. With this happening, there's also the Soviet Union who pushed back the Germans in 1944. Germany's mission to invade Russia, the Operation Barbarossa, fails. And it's because of the high casualties that happened within the Russian territory and also a bitter winter that stopped the Nazi advance. The Russians were able to get their second wind after a high amount of death that happened on both sides in that devastating war. For example, Battle of Stalingrad is considered one of the highest casualties battles of all of World War II. Millions die just in one battle for one city. That's how dramatic the Eastern Front is in this time period. Now, with the Soviets pushing to the center of Germany and also the Allied powers pushing also inward, you're starting to see the pinch that is the Nazis in this time period. And it's going to eventually end at the capital of Germany, which is the Battle for Berlin in 1945. Now, the Soviets get to Berlin sooner than the Allied powers did. And the Russians will start to invade the capital to be able to end the war. This was Germany's last stand, really, in their capital. And with the Russians on the outskirts of Berlin, an unexpected event happened, with Hitler committing suicide. With Hitler committing suicide, it leads to the further dissolving of the Nazi leadership, where eventually the remaining German forces will surrender unconditionally. This is the moment where in Europe the war is over. We celebrate it with something called VE Day, which is the victory in Europe which prompts great celebration both in Western Europe and the United States. But we still deal with the fact that there is still the war raging on the Pacific theater with Japan. There's a lot of questions, though, with the end of the war here, and that is, what will happen to the defeated Axis powers? And what will be the plans for rebuilding Europe? Once again, this is a lingering tension now with both the Russians and the Allied powers who will have to try to attempt to work with each other, which will later instead result into the Cold War. Before we continue, I want to kind of highlight that moment that must have been devastating for our Allied powers, like the American soldiers who discovered these death camps. You can only imagine the appalling and surprising shock that comes from the revelation of these extermination camps. Watch this video that really shows that moment. Thank you, I appreciate it. Here's our checkpoint. How does the war end in Europe? From what you remember from our lesson, how does the war end in Europe? What are the end results? Perfect, thank you. Now, let's focus on the Pacific. But here's a little bit of an update for you. There's been a few things that have changed since that checkpoint. That, of course, is a change in our leadership. What you can see from our team, we still have Stalin, but now we have the United States president, who has changed to now Truman. Truman is taking the place of FDR, who died from natural causes. And then, of course, we still have Churchill here as the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Also, there's been a change of players within the Japanese system as well. You still have the Emperor Hirohito, who is still in charge, and then you have Suzuki as the Prime Minister in this time period. Tojo did resign from this position during this time period. So, the battle continues in the Pacific, and there's a few notable battles in this time period that kind of show the United States creeping closer to the mainland of Japan. If you're looking at the map below, you can see how much had to be done to get us finally to the mainland of Japan itself, with the multiple years it took to be able to get there. There's a couple of notable battles, like I mentioned. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February of 1945, a small island off the coast of Japan, was fought for because of its proximity to Japan. It served as a buffer. However, after a bloody 5-week battle, the U.S. military will be able to capture this prize island. Japan suffered a large number of casualties. Only 200 out of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers survived. Along with it, there's also the Battle of Okinawa in June of 1945. Intended to be the last offensive attack of Japan, the U.S. military descends upon Okinawa. The U.S. capture another island just a short distance from Japan, and you'll see some desperate moves from the Japanese when they lose a lot of these offensive islands. And they start to do methods like the kamikaze missions, which is having suicide bombers dive into our ships to cause as much casualties as possible at the expense of their pilots. These start to issue a large blow to our U.S. fleet, as it's a new strategy that we now have to counteract. Okinawa is more deadly than Iwo Jima, with Americans holding 49,000 casualties and 110,000 Japanese soldiers who lose their lives. Between 40,000 to 150,000 Okinawa citizens are also killed in the crossfire, and also as many of those Japanese citizens were encouraged by their government to also take arms against the United States. This is the battles of the Japanese. These are the battles in the Pacific. They're really difficult taking these islands. It takes high casualties. The Japanese use methods we're not familiar with, like kamikazes and having suicide runs, traps, poisoning water, and all these other methods to mess with the psyche of the American soldier. But the end of the war in Pacific is not far. There is Japanese resistance, like I mentioned, with them becoming more desperate, where they start to do things like the kamikaze attacks. During and after the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, many Japanese began to commit seppuku, which is a form of ritual suicide that originated from the Japanese ancient samurai warrior class. Japanese citizens, especially women, feared what would happen if captured by Americans, and Japanese soldiers preferred this death rather than being captured by the American soldiers. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa and had devastated the Japanese industries and cities. With us making serious grounds in the Pacific, we're also going to be doing some serious developments within that wartime science and technology with what is the American nuclear test. Unknown to the Japanese, the United States had a secret project called the Manhattan Project, which was to detonate the first atomic bomb in New Mexico on July 17, 1945, to be able to show the new strength of this new technology in warfare. This bomb is catastrophic. It shows a larger magnitude of damage compared to any bomb before. At the largest, most bombs were considered blockbusters, which were bombs that were able to destroy a block of a city. But now, with the atomic bomb, you don't just take out a block, you take out the city. And that is a new power that the United States is eager to use to test out and to see its strength. There is a meeting, though, that is called the Potsdam Meeting, or Declaration, that happened in July 26 of 1945. Allies issued this declaration demanding for the unconditional surrender of all the Japanese armed forces. Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki responded by telling the press that his government was paying no attention to the Allied ultimatum. Japan was now at a disadvantage militaristically, suffering huge casualties, loss of territory, and lack of resources, which caused growing civil discontent among both civilians and military leaders. Regardless of this, the Japanese surrendering would be considered disgraceful and humiliating. So the Japanese were preparing their mainland for the invasion of the Allied powers. And they were to prepare by sending every man, woman, and child in the name of this war. There's even records of women being trained with spears to be able to combat against the American force, any way possible to resist. However, the Japanese military understood that they couldn't defend a war on two fronts. Both the US and the Soviet Union would be considered too much for the Japanese, and they were relying on their neutrality pact with the Soviets to be just focusing on one team or one nation instead of the two. But with those declarations being ignored, the atomic bombs are put to use. First being used in Hiroshima in August 6 of 1945. 11 days after the Japanese rejection of Potsdam Declaration, President Truman gives the order to drop the atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 80,000 people and fatally wounding thousands more. The Japanese War Council met to discuss their options. A half favored surrendering, but the other half was still waiting for confirmation that such devastation was true. When they heard about this atomic bomb, it was unthinkable that this kind of devastation could happen, and some just simply couldn't believe it. So no response from the Japanese came after Hiroshima, with thousands of people dying, both civilians, the military, and all. Then, more bad news for Japan. The Soviet Union declares war on August 8th of 1945. The Soviets declare war on the Japanese and invade certain territories that the Japanese had, which was Manchuria, China, and also break the neutrality pact that they had with the Japanese. The Japanese military was absolutely fearful of now the further Soviet aggressions that were to come. They could not handle this close neighbor who could also invade as well during this time period. But another news hits them. With the bombing of Nagasaki in August 9th of 1945, the United States drops the second atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki only 3 days after the first bombing. Another thousands and thousands of citizens die, resulting into higher casualty rates for the Japanese. These bombs are intense, and it is a monumental moment, one that we have never turned around from with the atomic bomb. Matter of fact, I want you to watch this next video that kind of captures this epic and tragic moment that happens in human history. Now, humanity has the capability of destroying cities and also the world with this new technology. Take a look. Thank you, I appreciate it. And now, here's that checkpoint for you. Was the nuclear bomb necessary? This is really opinionated. With the facts you heard, would you say the bomb was necessary? If we're talking about the bomb dropping, not just the first bomb, but then the second bomb, are two bombs necessary? What are your thoughts with the insight that you have? Perfect. Thank you for your opinion. I appreciate it. Many have different opinions on this conversation, and I was just curious to hear what yours would be. So let's talk aftermath of the war, because with the second bombing, the Japanese will have an unconditional surrendering mere days after, with now finally World War II ending. But what's the price? Casualties? The war had killed as many as 50 million people around the world. In Europe alone, 30 million people had lost their lives. More than half of them were citizens. This was a devastating war for both civilians and the military. The Soviet Union, though, suffered the most casualties, with over 20 million dead. It is still hard for historians to calculate the exact number because there were so many of those who died that were not registered or recorded, especially within the civilian count. If you're looking at my chart here, you can see the different kinds of countries with the different casualty rates. It is devastating across the board. Then, of course, there's the physical destruction. Germany, France, England, Poland, the Soviet Union, Japan, and China were unrecognizable after the destruction of World War II. The roads, railroads, cities, infrastructure, industries were destroyed, leading to millions becoming refugees, homeless, unemployed, without resources. Really, Europe falls off of the economic stage. Their industries are ruined, which then gives United States an opportunity to take on the responsibilities of withstanding and holding on to the international trade systems. We really blossom in the opportunity that we're the last empire standing who can now be able to import and export since our industries were not disrupted in this time period. The economic cost. When it comes to Europe, damage caused by bombings was most significant in Poland and Britain, with about 30% of their buildings destroyed. The economies in these countries were devastated, and it will take years to rebuild with the help of the international community and American banks. It was estimated that the total cost of the war was roughly $1 trillion. When it comes to Asia, vast majority of the invaded countries had their economies and resources commandeered by the Japanese. Japan also suffered, with 40% of their buildings being destroyed by the Allied bombings, including those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a whole other segment to the bombings that we didn't mention, with incendiary bombings that the United States will do as it carpet bombs multiple cities to be able to destroy the industries and functionality of the nation of Japan. If you're looking at my other chart, you'll see the wartime spending that it took to be able to fight this war. And lastly, the other development I want to talk about was the creation of the United Nations. This is a coalition of nations to keep the peace, which was a second version of what was the League of Nations. If you remember the League of Nations of World War I, it's those coalition of different democratic countries who get together to try to handle world issues to prevent them from becoming more dire. There is a very interesting system to it with hundreds of different UN members. There are 5 permanent members who are all the winners of World War II, like United States, the Soviet Union or Russia, Britain, France, and China. And those people have a very particular power and position within United Nations. This will be important in our next episode when this becomes challenged during the Cold War. But I just wanted to show you guys a little bit of the aftermath with not only the deaths like you see on my screen, but also the diplomacy that comes from World War II. Like you saw in this whole episode, World War II is an intense moment, but it also becomes an intense opportunity for the United States, where now it finds itself in a position of domination of all those other European and international nations across the world. We'll talk much more about how the United States handles this new world order and new world power when it becomes tested by the communist spread from the Soviet Union. But folks, that's for another episode. We've had plenty today with our lessons. Thank you so much for going through this. I'm so glad you learned so much more about World War II. There was plenty of it to go around when it came to things that maybe you knew and didn't know. But that's it for me, folks. That's the end of our lesson. Thank you so much for being here. And until next time, I'm Professor Martinez, and this was History Talks.